Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. We're really excited about this panel today. I think we have a stellar group of speakers for you, and certainly a very interesting topic. I will not give a long, substantive introduction. I think it's quite clear that the United States and Russia are in a competitive and increasingly adversarial relationship today. It's pretty clear that the CIA and the American intelligence community more broadly are really at the forefront in that, both in an operational sense because of the nature of some of the competition that we're engaged in, but also from an analytical perspective as the U.S. government tries to understand Russia, what it's doing, what it might do, what its motives are, and actually what its decision-making system is. What do we mean when we say Russia wants this or Russia wants that? I think we've got a great group here today to talk about that. We will introduce each of them sequentially as they speak. We will start with Peter Clement to my right, then we will go to my far left, Milton Bearden, and my colleague George Beebe will wrap up. Peter Clement to my right is a senior research fellow and an adjunct professor at Columbia University at the School of International and Public Affairs. He left the CIA just several months ago after a career there on the analytical side of the agency as director of the Office of Russian and Eurasian Analysis, as the deputy director for intelligence for analytic programs, and in a number of other key posts. Peter is a long-time Russia watcher, and we're very pleased that he could be with us today. Peter, thank you so much. Let's start with you, and I would ask each of you to try to limit it to 10 minutes. You see we have a big group. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions and discussion.
First, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to see a lot of old friends and colleagues, both from the intelligence community, from the think tank world and academia, other agencies around town, and even some media friends that I've made over the years. So thank you for having me today. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut right to the chase and try to identify a core question, either my thoughts on that core question, and hopefully frame the discussion that we have on the panel, but also during the Q&A. So the core question I've been thinking a lot about is what exactly is Putin going to do in the next 6 years now that he's won re-election? Does he have a strategy? What does he really seek to achieve during the time frame? I'm not even going to get into whether he's running again in 2024. Some of you may have seen that story out of Chechnya. There are already floating trial balloons that somebody might want to amend the Constitution for 2024. That's a whole subject to itself. I'm going to focus on the next 6 years. So as I look, by the way, I think everybody has become a Russia expert. It's impossible not to pick up a newspaper and everybody has an opinion on Putin. So I'm just one of them. I spent a lot of time looking at Russia, but I acknowledge the fact that there are an awful lot of people now who are looking closely at Mr. Putin and the Russians and what they're doing. In reading the wide range of literature that's out there now, I'm going to generalize and say there's basically two schools of thought that I'm seeing emerge on where Putin might be headed in the next 6 years. The first school is Putin is irrevocably turned away from the West. There's no way he's ever going to get back on track. And that perspective is epitomized by a recent article by Vladislav Surkov in Global Affairs, came out in early April. And I only cite that as a good academic friend of mine who's very plugged in to Russians and Ukrainians told me, Peter, you must read this article. This is what's really going on with Putin. And I read it, and I'm not entirely where he is on this, but it was a very provocative piece by Surkov, who supposedly is relatively close to Mr. Putin. And the thrust of it is basically, Russia is a half-blood. It is a half-breed. It is between East and West. And because of what's happened since 2014, since Crimea, We are now on a path where Russia will remain that way for at least a century or maybe even longer. It will never become part of the West. The die is cast. That's at one extreme on this spectrum. The other school of thought is, no. Putin's a realist. Putin understands there are certain things he must do to try to get Russia back on track for his own domestic economic reasons, for his own political position in terms of the relations he had with key oligarchs and colleagues who benefited from this cronyism system that he's put into place. And this school argues that on the economic side, Putin understands there has to be some interaction with the West, both politically and economically, if he's ever going to get Russia on a slightly different track, one specifically that takes him off the economy curse, if you will, the utter dependence on oil and gas. That if you can't start to seriously diversify that economy, Russia will remain what it is, always susceptible and vulnerable to the ebbs and flows in the oil market. The chronological sign that those people say is critical is, where's Mr. Kudrin, if he gets elevated at some point to become, again, Minister for Economics or Finance, or better yet, Prime Minister, that would be the biggest signal of all that Putin has decided we must really, really re-engage and we have the right guy who can do this. Now, in this recent announcement of the new cabinet positions, Kudrin was not among them. He was given the position as head of the audit chamber in the Federation Federal Assembly. Not exactly a big, powerful position, but nonetheless, for those who believe this particular track, he's sort of in a holding pattern, but he's still there. His name is still out there. Maybe Putin will see where things go, let Medvedev do some hard things, and then get rid of him and elevate Putin. Again, nobody knows. We don't have the answers to these. These are what I would call the two far ends of the spectrum. So what are some of the indicators I would look at, things I would look for to see maybe which direction Putin really is going? One thing I can say with a fairly high degree of confidence is every day you should be checking the price of oil. And I'm sure most of you do. But if you check this morning, TWI, Texas West crude is up at $72.30 a barrel. The Brent crude is at $79.60. Pretty high. For my money, no pun intended, to the extent these prices stay at roughly those levels for the coming 6 months, a year or so, basically Putin can put off the hard decision. They're getting a windfall right now, and it's certainly helping a lot. Remember, this year's budget is based on $44 a barrel oil. If you nearly double that, you have a lot more money to play with, and that gives you a little more breathing room, if you will, to get through where we are right now with all the sanctions that they're facing, and potentially even more sanctions that seem to be on tap. Second factor I would look at, and this one I actually picked up to, is legacy. I call it the legacy factor. I personally believe that Putin is all about legacy. This is a man who was obsessed with Russian history, and of course a lot of Russians are. I'm a little obsessed with it myself, having spent a lot of my life studying it. But Putin never misses an opportunity to reach back into various chapters in Russian history. This is most obvious in the March 18th speech after the annexation of Crimea. We were all told about Vladimir, the conversion to Christianity, and where that occurred and how important that was to rather solidify the idea that Crimea has always been and will remain always part of Russia because it's so core to its central identity going way back almost 1,000 years. When I'm struck, I was in Moscow last November and I hadn't been there in several years, and I came across this gigantic statue of Prince Vladimir in one of the entryways to the Kremlin in Red Square. It's 60 feet tall, and you have there is Vladimir with this huge, huge cross. So if you didn't catch the symbolism, it's not only Prince Vladimir in the old days, like the Kiev Rus period, but the same one who brought Christianity to Russia. The Ukrainians had a strong reaction to this, but there is, again, this reach back into history to show why things are the way they are and why they should be this way. So to close, on the legacy piece, I think if we're looking for potential indicators, you could have an interesting debate about what is it that Putin seeks to leave as his legacy. On the one hand, one could make an argument he reincorporated Crimea to its rightful place, quote unquote, back into the Russian Federation. He's built this amazing bridge, nearly 11.8 or 11.9 miles, which is nearing completion, by the way. If you get a chance to watch the video of Putin's trip to Kerch, schmoozing with all the construction engineers and the head of the project, but it's almost done. Sometime this summer they were already talking about maybe cars for travel to the beaches in Crimea. And I'm sure will also be part of his legacy, but it's directly linked to Crimea. Now, he's got broader ambitions, and I'm not dismissing this, although personally I'm not sure that's what he is, but you can't know these things with a high level of confidence. What if his broader goal is actually to reincorporate even more Ukraine? So that brings us to the constellations. So the things you should be looking for there are, do we see a step up tension, more fighting, more casualties, to the point where you have a crisis where the Russians have to intervene to protect the poor locals who are being abused by the Ukrainian government, and then annex yet another chunk of Ukraine. For people who think this might be a possibility, you should read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Rebuilding Russia, the book he wrote in 1990. I've always been struck by the great interest that Putin personally has in Mr. Solzhenitsyn. The irony there was, of course, pretty obvious. The very KGB that hounded Solzhenitsyn to kick him out of the country, now we've got a former KGB officer who's embraced him. And if you read Rebuilding Russia, you will understand why. I think there's a lot of commonality in the way they think about the Russian core. I'm going to leave that to the Q&A if people want to get into the Solzhenitsyn piece. It's a fascinating read. But I think for Putin, and these are where I look at some of the indicators, if you believe legacy is something that does drive his thinking, for my money, Ukraine is one of the places I would look most seriously. I'm going to stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much, Peter. So let's turn next to Milton Bearden. He left the CIA in 1994 after a 30-year career in the clandestine services. I think as many people know, he was the CIA officer who was assigned by the then director, Bill Casey, to run the CIA's operations in Pakistan and Afghanistan to counter the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. And for that effort, actually, he received the agency's highest decoration, the Distinguished Intelligence Medal. He also, from 1989 to 92, directed the clandestine operations against the Soviet Empire as a whole. And then following that was the chief of station in Bonn, as East and West Germany were uniting. So someone with a very deep and rich experience on the operational side of the CIA's work, and someone who has actually received not only the highest CIA medal, but also several other CIA medals for his distinguished service there. So we'll turn next to you, Mel. And thank you so much for coming.
And thanks for inviting me, Paul. It's an honor to be here. I'll cut quickly to the chase to keep this thing moving. Peter's right about Putin and his view of history, and the Russians in general, and how they actually know their history and what they think about it. For us Americans, now that I'm coming from Texas, it's surely true. Most Americans learn history from the football coach. But what I would do is to walk you through a little bit of the operational history to begin with the Soviet Union from my perspective. First as deputy chief, then the Soviet East European division, then the Afghan adventure with the Soviets, and then sitting as the chief job as the Soviet Union disappeared. 1985, when I was deputy chief, was the year of the spy. We were wrapped up with a realization that CIA could be penetrated and just about every other agency in Washington would be penetrated. We saw this, the evidence of this is we watched one after another of our assets in Moscow being taken down into the basement of the Fortimo and shot in the back of the head. When Edward Lee Howard, who we had dismissed because of suitability issues, as we said, turned out defecting to the Soviet Union. We thought we had found our answer. Indeed, we had not, because still alive and well were Aldrich James and Robert Hansen, and the betrayals went on. I did move them, at Bill Casey's request, into Pakistan to take over the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan from 1986 to 89, and at that moment, General Morris, the Iron Man, Romoff, in a very theatrical meeting with his young son Maxim on Friendship Bridge, marched out of Afghanistan as the hero of Afghanistan. And that ended a 10-year, almost 10-year adventure in Afghanistan, which I think brought about some of the things that randomly followed. To wit, in May of the next year, the Hungarians cut the wire on the border with Austria, and people began to move rapidly from east to west. And then you had in June the elections in Poland, where communism was actually voted out of the Warsaw country. And all through the summer and into the fall of that year, the demonstrations started in Dresden and Leipzig, a few hundred and then a few thousand. And then by the fall, by November in 1989, you had the Berlin Wall was breached. 329 days later, Germany was reunited inside NATO. Stunning political maneuvers by the United States and Helmut Kohl and others. And I think more clueless Gorbachev than others might give it. As then the rapid dissolution, the Warsaw Pact on March 31st, and I think they held off or moved it up a day so it wouldn't happen on April Fool's Day. The Warsaw Pact. So it slipped beneath the waves, and it was over. It wasn't long before a small detachment of Red Army soldiers marched out on the Kremlin Wall and hauled down the hammer and sickle and hoisted the Russian tricolor. And that was it. That was sort of the end of this long experiment. What I would leave you with, so that we can talk in the Q&A, is that at every step of the way, I think that the Soviets, the KGB, Putin's, and all of the KGB officers that I knew blamed us for everything that happened. They gave us credit that was something like James Angleton gave the Russians credit for in the early days of the CIA. When I was in Moscow after the coup against Gorbachev, I was told that we were watching CNN the whole time, and when Bush came out, and Gates was there with him, and Bush said, "Coups sometimes fail. We knew that you knew what was going on in the White House." And we just threw up our hands and went to our houses. And they let this thing play out as it did. And so I do think that to answer one of the questions Peter raised is that there is a visceral, a history-based, and perhaps faulty history of these more recent years that it's payback time for the United States, that we, in fact, brought about all of this that they may long for, and none of it that their kids seem to enjoy most. So let me leave it at that. We can go into however we like to play this out.
Milt, maybe I could ask, but before we turn to George, one kind of pointed question. As you think back to the kind of Soviet operations directed against the United States during that time period, do you see any similarities with the current environment, or perhaps differences? Would you draw any particular lessons from how we kind of managed the competition at that time that might be relevant today?
I think we were far less vulnerable across the board during my time when the Soviets were trying as many things as they might. NATO was reasonably strong. The Soviets, don't forget, would remind us every so often of who they were. Hungary in '56, Berlin in '48, before that, Czechoslovakia in 1968, their intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. So about every 10 years or so, they would do something that would remind us exactly what the Soviet Union was. And so any progress they might have made against us with the immense, and I think that's the only word I could use, the immense amount of soft power that the United States had during most of that period, failed. I mean, they may have made some moves on the margins that were pretty good. I think moving against a larger American target, they simply didn't fail. Today, it's different. I think that the Europeans could, at this point, be managed to believe almost anything about the United States as populations, much more readily than when we had 360,000 American GIs looking across the Fulda Gap at a similar number of Soviets. The rest of NATO, a lot of people dismissed as generals and bands. I think that Putin particularly will move against us where we might be most vulnerable today, and I would say that's going to be in Europe and the NATO alliance, and by an extension that the European Union itself.
Sorry. Thank you. So let's turn last to my colleague, George Beebe. Like Peter, career CIA analyst, a former head of the Russian analysis programs at the agency, and a former national security aide to Vice President Dick Cheney, now the director of our intelligence and national security program here, and a delightful colleague. George.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to start out by misquoting one of our nation's most famous intelligence analysts, and that's Mark Twain. The quote is, "It's not the things that you don't know that get you in trouble, it's the things that you know for sure that just ain't so." There's a great deal of truth in this, even though Twain never actually said it, as far as I know. And today I think we have a problem with something that we all know for sure about Russia, and that is Russia's intentions toward the United States. So I want to read you some quotes about what prominent Americans are saying about these intentions. "Russia hopes to fatally undermine a distracted West," as from George Will, well-known conservative columnist. "Putin's fundamental goal is undermining American democracy." That's Paul Waldman, who comes at things from a little bit different political point of view. "Russia is attempting to destroy democracy in the United States." That's Republican Senator John McCain. Russia is trying to bring down our way of government. That's Democratic Senator Ben Cardin. Putin wants to make the world safe for Russian autocracy, which means compromising every democratic center of power he can find and crushing democracy closer to home. That's a former senior State Department official. I think fundamentally there is an aversion to our whole system, an aversion to democracy. Putin doesn't believe in it and views it as threatening to him personally. I just think that it's almost in his genes, in the Russian genes, to do what they did in meddling in the US election, and they'll continue to do it. That's James Clapper, now retired Director of National Intelligence. And Clapper summed up all of this in one neat soundbite, and that is, they're in to do us in. In other words, Russia may not aspire to incinerate the United States physically, although it certainly has the wherewithal of doing that, but rather it hopes to undermine our democratic institutions, to set Americans against each other, conquer our nation by exacerbating divisions and dysfunction. There's almost nobody on the US political spectrum today that takes issue with that. This is something that we seem to know for sure. But I would argue this is something that could get us in trouble because we haven't looked very deeply at this question. This is something that's an important function of intelligence analysis. Understanding the intentions of foreign adversaries is critical to understanding the nature of the threat, how real it is, how damaging it might be, and also formulating effective responses to dealing with that threat. If you get the intentions wrong, you oftentimes get your prescriptions wrong. But it's not an easy thing to do. It requires what you might call analytic empathy. Just walking around in somebody else's shoes for a while, seeing things through their eyes, understanding their hopes and fears, their goals, their aspirations, the constraints they're under. Nobody is very good at this. It's hard to do this when you know the people well. We all have scratched our heads over why a family member is doing things that they're doing. Trying to understand what they could be thinking is hard. It's particularly hard when you're dealing with a foreign adversary, a group of people with different histories, cultures, beliefs, perceptions. So we need to approach this with a good deal of analytic humility. So how do we do this in the case of Russia? How do we compare this belief that Russia is actually trying to destroy democracy in the United States to reality? How do we do something that is inherently a subjective thing? Perceptions are squishy, but tackle it in an objective way. So I'll offer a couple of suggestions in this. One is, let's take a look at what the Russians are saying about our perceptions. They're well aware of what the state of our beliefs are about Russia and Russia's intentions. They follow this with a good deal of interest. So what are they saying about us? Second thing, what are they doing? How do words and deeds match up? If in fact these are their intentions, are they doing things that are consistent with those goals? And are they doing things that are inconsistent with those goals? Things that you would expect to see, but you don't see. And then the third thing I'd ask is, are there ends and means in a rough balance here? Do their activities actually add up to the kinds of objectives that we're positing that they've got? So I'm going to run through this very quickly. What are the Russians saying about our perceptions? I'm going to read a few more quotes for you. Anything they publish about Russia is, as a general rule, total garbage. The image of Putin's Russia constructed by Western and above all American media outlets over the past 18 months shocks even the most anti-Putin reader in Russia. That's from Oleg Kashin, who is a liberal Russian journalist and a very staunch Putin opponent. So he's looking at what we're saying about Russia and saying, I don't recognize the country you're describing. Another quote. Only a blind man would not see that Russia and its diplomats are fixated not on preserving dictatorship, but on observing principles. Russia is aware that a regime change could result in chaos and anarchy, as was the case in Iraq and Libya. More often than not, the road to hell is paved in good intentions. That's Analytic Empathy, senior Russian foreign policy advisor, a Putin supporter. Last quote. What this hype is really doing is elevating the Kremlin to the position of the world's meddler-in-chief by reading a coherent strategy into isolated and disparate trolling and propaganda efforts by various Russian institutions and individuals. I'm an agnostic as to whether a strategy aimed at undermining democracies all over the world exists, but everything I know about how Russia and its government work makes me doubt it. That's Maxim Trudeau-Lyubov, who is another Russian journalist, liberal, and very much a skeptic of President Putin. So you can see there's a real contrast between what the Russians say when they look at what we're seeing about their intentions and what we're seeing. So why does this matter? Well, it matters in part because it affects Russian behaviors. The presidential election held in Russia in March, one of the noteworthy results about this, constituencies that have typically not been great fans of Putin, people living in wealthy urban areas, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Russian diaspora, Russian citizens living abroad, who are living abroad for a reason. They don't particularly like what's going on inside Russia under Putin. So living in Europe, living in the United States, they voted in much greater numbers for Putin in this past election than they ever have in the past. Why? Well, part of the reason is what they themselves cite as a reaction to what they call Russophobia in the West. They don't like what's going on, and it's actually causing a rally around Putin effect inside Russia. Not something that is, I think, in U.S. interest to see. So the second question, what do they do? Here I want to look at a couple of counterfactuals that should cause us to question the conventional wisdom about Russian intentions. So if Russia regards democracy as a moral threat, something that by its very nature threatens the viability of the Russian state, is this evident in how they treat democracies around the world? I think the evidence says no, actually. And the news from a couple of weeks ago should give us some pause in this regard. Russia was celebrating Victory Day, May 9th, celebrating the triumph over Nazi Germany in World War II. Victory parade in Moscow, Vladimir Putin is marching. Who's next to him? Benjamin Netanyahu, who in fact talks to Putin probably more often than any other foreign leader. There's a close relationship between Israel and Russia. Do they agree on everything? Absolutely not. Their interests converge in some areas and diverge in others in very important ways. But they're able to manage their disagreements in a way that's pragmatic. There's no evidence whatsoever that democracy in Israel, which is about as democratic a system as you're going to find, in any way causes heartburn in Russia. I think the same thing applies in India. A long-standing historic relationship there. India and Russia do not agree on everything. There are some significant differences in their outlook and their interests. But Indian democracy, the world's largest democracy, as far as I can tell, doesn't cause any heartburn in Moscow itself. Ideologically, systemically, it is not a threat. Last question. How do ends and means balance there? And here I think there are a couple things that we would want to focus on. what things would we have expected the Russians to do back in the 2016 presidential election if they were really trying to sabotage U.S. democracy, as opposed to poking their finger in our eye, by contrast? Well, one of the things that they could have done was to circulate disinformation that they were messing with the vote counting. Now, as you know, there's a lot of evidence that they probed vote counting systems in a lot of states. As far as I know, no evidence that they actually sabotaged the vote count. But what's interesting here is not that they didn't try to sabotage the vote count, it's that no Russian propaganda organ, no Russian links troll, no cutout that could have had plausible deniability suggested that they had. And it's not hard to imagine that the mere suggestion, the rumor that these votes were somehow inauthentic would have caused a big problem in the United States, a crisis of confidence that the election was in fact legitimate. Why not? Why didn't the Russians throw a little bit of disinformation out there that they could have distanced themselves from, that nonetheless would have gummed up the works and perceptions here about the legitimacy of the election? I would further say that when you look at what the Russians actually did during the election, you don't see a discernible pattern in their advertising placements on social media, in the trolling postings that went on. Their messaging was all over the map. They had no real consistent themes. It didn't look like they were targeting swing states with any kind of coherent strategy. And finally, it's pretty clear that the Russians have the ability in the cyber realm to do some things that haven't happened. They can turn out the lights in key areas, at least temporarily. They could mess with Wall Street trading systems. Now, this would obviously be quite provocative acts, probably regarded as acts of war here in the United States. They would certainly have quite a detrimental effect on the functioning of our system. Why hasn't Russia done that? Things that were within their capability. And the obvious answer is, well, bad things would happen if they were to do that. And I think that's exactly the point. There are other higher priorities that the Russians have right now beyond destroying our democracy. I don't want to get into a great deal of discussion on this, but I would offer two things that are probably much more important goals for the Russians right now. One is they want us to knock off the democracy crusade. Democracy by itself doesn't threaten them. It's not who we are that they're concerned about, it's what we do. Attempting to spread democracy abroad in key parts of the world that affect Russian interests and inside Russia itself in ways that the Russians believe are destabilizing, that bring disorder and chaos and violence, not prosperity and order. That they find threatening, that they want to change, no question about it. And they want to corral American power, counterbalance it. And they believe that Russia has a critical role to play in doing that. But destroying us, undermining our system from within, actually presents more problems for Russian interests than it solves. Why? Well, not hard to imagine the impact on the global economy of real disorder here. Russia is a part of the global economy. There's no way they escape the damaging effects of that sort of outcome for them. Who would control U.S. nuclear weapons? Big question if the U.S. really starts to implode. What about the impact on other regions of instability spreading out from the United States? Again, those are real concerns that anybody in Moscow would have to wrestle with as they think about what their goals are vis-a-vis the United States. I'll leave you with a final thought before we go to the Q&A, and it's a quote from an actual American Soviet expert, Martin Malyev. who wrote a book that I would recommend to everyone called Russia Under Western Eyes, looking at changing perceptions of Russia over the course of history in Europe and the United States. And he says that Western opinion has traditionally either demonized or what he calls idealized or divinized Russia, less because of her real role in Europe and the United States than because of the fears and frustrations, the hopes and aspirations generated within Western society itself by its own domestic problems. And I would submit today that the United States is going through a period of rather significant domestic problems. A crisis in confidence that's generated largely from within. We're projecting many of those domestic problems and fears onto Russia and positing that they reflect actual Russian intentions. I think we have to look at this with a great deal more scrutiny.
Thank you very much, George. But before we open it up to questions, George has set out a thesis that I think is somewhat controversial in the context of our current domestic debates. Maybe I could ask each of you, Peter and Milt, to react briefly to that. Perhaps you first. Well, let's focus in on our kind of public discussion of Russia's motives and intent toward the United States.
I'm largely in agreement with the idea that I don't think Putin seeks to destroy the U.S. In part for the reasons that George has cited, but also because a lot of our internal domestic problems are in fact of our own doing. I think they've very effectively exploited it. I do agree with the intelligence community assessment that came out in January of 2017 about Russian interference, and there's no question that that occurred, in part because of the dislike of Senator Clement, Secretary Clement. And there's a long history there, which we can get into in the Q&A if you want to do this more about that issue, but I think it's a deep, long, rich history that was very focused on her. And it's going back to, secondary benefits from doing this kind of intervention. But the core issue of polarization, I think, was already there. I don't think this was generating a lot of questions.
Thanks very much, Peter. Milt, do you have any kind of reaction to this?
I do. I don't think that Vladimir Putin, I think, is a realist wants to destroy us or our democracy. I think that's too far-fetched for him. But I do think that and I agree with Peter, that they did meddle. I don't know the extent to what the meddling amounted to in the election that they were there, and we'll do it again if we can. I do think that they see some of what has been generated by issues here in America as opening up very good options for them in, let's say, with NATO. I think they'll be pushing hard on putting pressure on NATO based on how we're treating NATO ourselves and how well they can probably do it. I do think that while the things they haven't done, indeed they haven't done, but there are options that are still open to them. The one I would throw out to all of us is, I don't know what percentage of Americans and believe that there is a homage file on our current president. I think it's almost everybody. It doesn't matter what is in the file. At some point, it would serve the interests of Vladimir Putin to put something out there that would end up first in the Daily Mail or God knows where. It could be true or not true. It could be whatever they wanted to do to stir up trouble in Washington. They could very well have that. And it doesn't have to be directly, it could be the way they usually do things. It ends up through 2 or 3 cutouts, and then we trust that somebody was able to steal it right out of the compromise file, and it could cause great grief here. So I think they can do great things in Europe, and they cannot pass that up. To have a NATO continuing after the Warsaw Pact is so long gone, I don't think they can pass that up.
George, any reaction on your part, and then we'll open it up.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. One on NATO, I think, I agree with Milton. I think the Russians see it very much in their interest to chip away and undermine NATO. That's a almost universally good thing from their point of view. Not very much downside, and it's a target that gives them an awful lot of opportunities. One thing on the compromise file, the Steele dossier, that I think is interesting, that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. If the Russians really wanted to mess with us on this, they could put out some disinformation on the compromise file that they've got on Trump, whether they have it or not.
Yeah.
And that would have a sensational impact on our domestic debate.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have to be true. In fact, it might even be better and more effective if it weren't. But that would really throw us into a tizzy. And again, a question I think we need to ask ourselves is, why haven't they done that? Meaning the Steele dossier itself might have been disinformation.
Well, as you know, the Russians have arrested several former FSB officers for alleged treason, and there was a lot of speculation in the press, including the opposition press, that these were people who contributed to the Steele dossier. You also know that as the Russians dislike Hillary Clinton, they also had a lot of people in her camp who had a long history of, how to put it, friendship with the Soviet Union and friendship with Russia. Mr. Bearden was in Moscow in March 2016 and met with the leadership of FSB. From what I understand, he had some other interesting meetings in Moscow. Now, if you take a position that contacts with the Russians, particularly contacts with Russian security services, that there may be some hidden meaning to them, why wouldn't you at least entertain a possibility that Russia was prepared to create trouble, to play both sides? They all expected Hillary Clinton to win, at least that's what we were told. Why wouldn't we at least think about an alternative scenario, that they wanted to create political uncertainty and polarization in the United States?
Well, I think it's possible. It gives them credit for a great deal of political prescience in the United States that is uncommon. Knowing how this would play out, for example, within our domestic debate. And I think, in retrospect, looking at how Russia has reacted to what's going on here and our perceptions of Russia and our domestic discussions about Russia's role in all of this, what I'm struck by is how surprised they are. How much their reaction has been one of, wait a minute, you're the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful economy, all this soft power, long-standing, deeply rooted political traditions, and you've lost your mojo. You suddenly believe that we, Russia, which lost our country not too long ago, which basically had very little power, very little capability, a lot of ineptitude, you now fear that we're going to destroy you. They're almost amazed that that's how we're thinking. And I don't think they anticipated it. I think this has come as a surprise to them. So I don't rule out the scenario you're talking about, but it doesn't strike me as very consistent with how the Russians have reacted to events here. And frankly, I think a lot of Americans are surprised by how we've reacted to
But
it
who
too.
would be the Russians trying to interfere? Whichever reason?
There's no question that the Russians interfered. What's really in doubt here are things like intentions and the chain of decision-making that was behind all this. Clearly that they were involved in doing a number of things here. But why? What motivated this? That's something that I think we're not yet looking at with very much scrutiny.
This was Senator President Dimitri Saunders. Peter Clement.
Just one quick point. If you haven't reread it recently, it really is worth reading the unclassified key judgments from the Intelligence Committee assessment that came out. Part of the analytic line there was the Russians did actually think that Hillary probably was going to win, like everybody else on Earth. And that part of their motivation in trying to discredit her, put out all this stuff about her health and well-being, how cranky she could be or whatever, was in part designed to make her less effective as president after she got elected. And I think they, like everyone else, were surprised at the outcome. And because more and more has come out about the extent of their interference, use of social media and so on, they actually created this problem that they now have. It's impossible to engage in the United States. The ambassador was complaining how he didn't get the time of day to speak to anybody on Capitol Hill. It's rare for him to get people to answer the phone. So this is the net result of all this. They've become like political kryptonite. Who's going to go close to these people in the current political environment, and how are we ever going to re-engage in this environment?
You know, I would suggest a point that Simon's raised as well on the compromise file. My assessment is that it, again, as George pointed out, it doesn't have to be true to be much more interesting if it's not true. The point that Dimitri made is that maybe it's already been done. I think that something bigger hasn't been done, simply because we're doing a good enough job ourselves. If you look at any cable news outlet, it will tell you that it's the 483rd day of the Trump presidency instead of almost anything else. They can look at this and say it's going just fine. If it were to get any better, they have that option, is to throw something else out there. And it'll be believed by the necessary amount of Americans and not believed by that other amount of Americans, which gave us what we have today. And so it will continue to stir the pot. I think that they're as amazed by what we're doing to ourselves as perhaps we are. But I think they're paying closer attention to it than we may give them credit, and waiting for openings to do something, not to destroy this democracy or the Indian democracy. I think it's a bridge too far. But based on the belief that diminishing us can make them rise, and maybe it does in some Western European areas, then I think they'll do it.
All right, let's open it up. We have on the right here first Anton Pedyashin, and then Paul, and then I see you waiting there.
Thank you. Anton Pedyashin, American University. Thank you for the wonderful panel, since I'm opening the questions. For George Beebe, but I guess anyone can answer. During the Soviet Union, the U.S. had a very good excuse for the dearth of human intelligence on the USSR. It was a closed society, it was hyper-security conscious. Russia has been an open society, and if you believe in the level of corruption in the country, it's been hyper-open to human intelligence being recruited. And yet one of the running themes that I hear, especially in the past 18 months, is how little concept we have of the decision-making in the Kremlin. Is there a fundamental problem with recruiting human intelligence on the highest level of decision-making in Moscow, or is it something else that George, I think, referred to, which is that there's an inability to understand the motivating factors of Russian decision-making, and it goes back to education and to assumptions. Or is it over-reliance on liberal journalists, dissidents, and exiled oligarchs as sources of information, which lead to non-stop surprise about Russian decision-making in the West? Thanks.
George, I think that was directed to you, but Peter and Milton.
I would like to hear Milt's comments on this, actually, since he was more directly involved in that sort of thing than I was. Well, on the one hand, I think, although Russia is more open, and in some senses more vulnerable to what you might say cash incentives to become a source for U.S. intelligence, the Kremlin is a more difficult target than it used to be back in the 1990s. And I think there's some very specific reasons for that. But Putin, being a former KGB officer, is quite security conscious. From what I have read, he doesn't use a computer. He doesn't talk on the phone. So that's a hard target. And a lot of the senior officials in Russia's government are patriotic, what the Russians call государственники, people who believe very strongly in the guiding role, the importance of the Russian state. So those are not folks that are particularly vulnerable to the sorts of enticements that one might rely on for human recruitment, and it's not an easy technical target to penetrate. That said, I think Putin and a number of the other folks in the Russian leadership have been quite transparent about their goals, and have been going all the way back to the so-called Millennium document that Putin issued back at the turn of this millennium, saying the condition that Russia finds itself in, here's what we need to do to move toward a better future. And you look back, and I think it's pretty close to what they've actually done. So if you want to understand Russian intentions, I think one way to do that is to look at what they've said compared to what they've done. It's actually a pretty good guide.
Mel.
Yeah, the recruitment of Soviet sources or Russian sources back in the Cold War period, where my service was focused, almost everybody that they took into the basement of course, or Eurasian chapter back in the and volunteered. These weren't people that were wined and dined and developed and recruited. They had somehow dropped a note into a car and said, call this number or something, some way of volunteering. Some of them compromised themselves in the process. Others, like Adolf Topachuk, came to us and gave us everything the Soviets would be doing on advanced fighter aircraft into generations that would be out in the future. So it's not that they're not recruiting, it's that they're not volunteering, perhaps. And then you would say, well, why is that? Right. And is it because we have had that rash of betrayal inside the FBI, inside the CIA, and that might discourage volunteers? It really had never happened until 1985. And we were able to say, well, Edward Lee Howard wasn't really one of us. He betrayed. He was in the pipeline to Moscow, so he knew our assets in Moscow because he might be called upon to break surveillance and go out and make that meeting. So he was able to betray a huge number of assets, but we got him on suitability issues, blah, 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 and kicked him out. So we said, well, bad, but not, he really wasn't one of us. Now, guess what? Alder James certainly was. And Hanson over at the Bureau certainly was. And that we even forget about Jim Nicholson, another one who certainly was. So to Has that affected volunteers into this era? I don't know. But the story then, and I suspect now, is that your greatest source of assets in Moscow have always been volunteers.
Yeah, just a very quick comment, 2 quick points. One, Anton, I don't know that I fully subscribe to the idea that Russia's so entirely open right now. I think an awful lot of people are under surveillance and they're watched pretty closely. So maybe they can wander around and talk to people and make business deals and so on, but it's still a security state, in my view. Secondly, I'm amazed at how the narrative about what the U.S. is doing to undermine Russia has permeated even well-educated people. I had a conversation recently with a Russian academic, a person in their mid-30s who was incredibly intelligent and pretty candid about a whole range of foreign policy issues. And I made the mistake in asking how they voted in the election, you know, to get a little domestic peace going here. And I said, and this person said, well, you know, of course I voted for Putin, but, you know, it was sort of a reluctant vote, but, you know, what am I going to do? And I said, oh, you didn't want to vote for send yourself Chuck. And this person at first laughed and said, oh, Peter, come on, are you serious? We all know she works for you guys, as does Navalny. And she was deadly serious. She was not kidding. And so that got me thinking, you know, this narrative that they're putting out there, very well-educated people who in the past I would have thought were a lot smarter, they absolutely believe this person was not kidding.
But they managed to believe that kind of thing going back into the 80s and 90s as well. I mean, they looked at, saw George Bush say coups fail. They said, you guys had more people in the White House than we did.
The Russian White House.
The Russian White House. than we did. I mean, this belief about the American intelligence capabilities, I think, has always been, for good reason, inflated, thoughtfully inflated.
My second point I forgot is I think it's a lot harder to conduct espionage, and this is a whole separate subject, but I think in the era of smartphones and the internet and cyber, running around trying to maintain any kind of cover is much, much harder. And so recruiting people and evading surveillance and so on, it's a whole different ballgame than it was pre-internet.
I'll pile on that one and make a controversial statement. I think the era of human recruitment and intelligence is over. Biometric data mean essentially that you cannot put someone undercover here in Washington, have them travel around the world, pose as a diplomat undercover, and recruit people. It doesn't work. That who they are, their identity is instantly known to governments that want to know who they are. Tracking them on their cell phones, investigating their social media histories, makes it almost impossible. So espionage, I think, is going to go in the direction of the digital domain. It's going to be cyber. It's far easier to get access to people and information in massive quantities than it just doesn't pay to try to do this through the old means. Now, there are pros and cons to that, but it does get to the question of assessing intentions. Because downloading reams of data from a target abroad is one thing. Getting the perspective on this that you can only get by talking to people that can help you understand what it looks like through someone else's eyes is an important part of this. It's something that's probably going to be harder to do as technology changes espionage.
Let's go to Paul. Please identify yourself.
Yeah. Milt, Peter, good to see you both. Apart from the comments on Compromat and the Steele dossier, the panel didn't say much about Donald Trump and what's received enormous attention in this country, how someone whose election was aided in part by Russian activity, what his attitude toward Russia is, and how a president who's insulted scores of foreign leaders hasn't seemed to do that to Putin. So my question is, what do you think is Putin's perception today of Trump? Is he seen as a useful idiot? As someone perhaps whose thinking on policy is so inchoate he doesn't really drive U.S. policy toward Russia? someone whose business interests provide a source of potential future leverage, or something else?
Well, there's a reason I never even wanted to broach that subject. And part of it is, I wouldn't even know how to begin to answer that question. I have no idea what Putin thinks about Trump. He obviously has tried to communicate, so has Trump tried to communicate with Putin. But I used the word kryptonite very consciously earlier. I think it's almost impossible at this point, because it's so politically charged, that you could hardly engage. And you know, to speculate about what Putin thinks or doesn't think, I don't know how fruitful that is. I actually don't try to fathom Putin's head on this one.
I would suggest that Putin knows more than we do in this room, and perhaps not as much as agencies know. But he's got all those Deutsche Bank accounts analyzed. He's got all of that. Or when Eric Trump has said we've got a lot of Russian money coming in, he knows exactly what that meant. And I still think he's sitting and waiting until he needs to make any sort of a move, and trying to decide at the same time what that move might be. I think I would throw a question out there: is Putin smart enough to say, don't do anything now? Let's let them do what they're doing to themselves, and sort it out if we have to intervene or to tweak what's going on in America. This is unique. I think we're at in my lifetime, unique point, and that's a pretty long time.
George, anything to add?
It's an interesting question, an interesting thought exercise. We have very little direct evidence of what Putin actually thinks about it, necessarily. But I'd offer a couple of metrics on this. One is, to what degree is Trump advancing Russian interests in the world, things that Russia would like to see. And I think there's got to be disappointment there. During the campaign, Trump obviously said some things which had a lot of appeal for Russia. How we needed to tone back on the messianic approach to spreading democracy in the world, and our involvement in regional conflicts that Russians have felt have been quite counterproductive and deleterious for their interests. So for a candidate to come in, and really he was the only one. When you look at the Republican and Democratic candidates, none of them were saying, hey, we need to rethink what we're doing in the world. Trump was really the only one, and I think that inspired a little bit of hope in Moscow, even though they thought he was very unlikely to ever be president. The actual track record of what's been done since Trump was inaugurated is not at all what we would have expected, what the Russians would have expected, judging from the campaign rhetoric. That's got to be a disappointment. Second thing is, Trump is someone that believes in a strong, unified, purposeful state. A government that is adept at identifying its interests, threats to them, putting together coherent strategies, implementing them. Now, the degree to which Russia's actually succeeded in doing that is debatable, but he's someone who in principle believes that's the role: strong executive, strong top-down power. And with that as a metric for assessing Trump, again, I would imagine that Putin's not impressed with the degree to which, under Trump, we've had a unified, coherent, purposeful government that has its act together, things that he prizes. So, do I know that that's how he perceives Trump? As someone incompetent and not really in control? No, I don't. But it's not hard for me to imagine that he might have that impression.
All right, thanks very much. We had Wayne Berry next, and then Spencer.
Thank you, Wayne Berry, the American Foreign Policy Council. George has given us a number of good quotes. I feel compelled to give you my favorite, which is from Bismarck, who knew Russia rather well, that Russia is never either as strong as it appears or as weak as it appears. And this is a large part of our American problem. 20 years ago, we were persuaded that Russia would be weak forever, and we talked about a world without Russia and all these sorts of things. Today, we look at a country that's got the 12th largest economy in the world, that doesn't have a hope in hell of meeting Putin's promise to become number 5 by the end of his current term. And we enormously inflate it, whereas in fact is a relative midget compared with Western Europe or China or even much of South Asia. But another point is this whole business of trying to find what you call westernizing, leavening intellectual forces in Russia. The problem is most of them have gotten out. The kinds of people who made contact with me as a young American diplomat in Moscow in the Brezhnev era, or who could come to my apartment for dinner in the Yeltsin era, I still see some of them. They're in New York. They're in Southern California. If you're a Russian who's really unhappy, you don't have to betray your country. You just leave it. And that loss of that quality of people in terms of aspirations, in terms of where they want their children to grow up, is a fundamental, not only failure of current Russia, but it renders Russia weak in ways that even places like Iran and China, I think, are not. This is a case where I think Russia may be even weaker than it appears.
Any reaction to that?
Back to the earlier question on recruitment of sources, and that most of them in the coldest of the Cold War period were volunteers. They could volunteer. They could drop a note in that little crack that we left in our cars in Moscow. But now they can buy a ticket to London or New York if they can get a visa. And that just simply was not something that was part of the equation in those days. So it is a much more complicated intelligence target, because I believe that so many of those people who have been locked inside might have the courage to volunteer, or just gotten out and didn't say anything anymore. So it's a totally different target group today. And they're gone again.
Let's come over here, Spencer. Sorry, right here.
Oh, hey.
Yes.
Sydney.
Sydney, sorry.
That's okay. Spencer's a nicer name.
I apologize.
I'm Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Setting aside the United States with the understanding that anything they do here is a means to an end, rather than their primary objective as they sit notoriously cackling and stroking their long mustaches. What are the primary objectives, the things that they'll take a risk for? Is it, more territory in Ukraine? Is it breaking the Baltics out of NATO or Finlandizing them? And what are the actions they might take in the near abroad, in Western Europe and in the United States to facilitate those goals, those real, right up against the border things they really care passionately about because they see it as, still theirs.
Peter?
That's a great question. I do think there are some antidotes. I think Ukraine is high on the list for obvious reasons. That is a direct national security concern. This is why Putin went in there in the first place. Whether he has other ambitions, that's in the category I was suggesting earlier. It's hard to know that. I'm going to be looking for indicators. And one thing I can say, though, there's a story in the papers today about Sweden. All of a sudden, Sweden's talking about maybe we should all join aide. I didn't see that coming exactly, but I suspect Putin must have taken notice or somebody, and they're thinking, this is the flip side of if you're too aggressive and too assertive. As in the case of Ukraine, the goal is to make sure you keep that NATO threat away from your border. The antagonism that you've created with the West and also with certain parts of Ukraine, you might actually bring that reality closer to home, in this case the Swedes. I think in the Ukraine case, I didn't mention my second alternative. I said the one about if Putin's thinking legacy and I want to incorporate more of Ukraine, we can hype up the pressure and have a minor conflict and then have a basis for annexation. The flip side of it is, and this is probably the one that I subscribe to personally, is the frozen conflict approach. If your goal is to keep NATO out of Ukraine forever, you can achieve that goal without annexing Donetsk and Luhansk. You maintain a permanent territorial problem, which by definition keeps them from even consideration in NATO membership. And essentially, you've kind of neutralized Ukraine. On the other hand, if you get into a crisis mode and you were to actually detach parts of East Ukraine, the likelihood the rest of Ukraine will join NATO. There will be a strong desire to do that. So I suspect finding that right balance there is pretty important, and I suspect Putin is shrewd enough to figure that out. We'll see. It gets to my legacy issue. What do you want his legacy to be? The great gatherer of Russian lands that Solzhenitsyn talks about, to include all of Ukraine and Belarus and northern Kazakhstan, or do you want more realistic? My personal view, probably more the latter, but I'm never ruling anything out.
George or Milton?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. There's been a long-standing debate about Russia and the Soviet Union over offense versus defense. John Mearsheimer had a Foreign Affairs article a couple of years ago after the Ukraine annexation saying, Ukraine is the Westfall. This is the result of Russia's defensive reaction to the possibility of NATO moving into Ukraine over time. Any great power would have reacted this way. And against that, there are those that argue that Russia is actually fundamentally offensive in its behavior. You don't annex territory more or less by force in the 21st century unless you have fundamentally aggressive intentions. I think the difficulty here is that it's really both. The Russians are simultaneously driven by both offensive ambitions and defensive fears. Their concerns about NATO's eastward expansion are real. Are they exaggerated? Yes, probably, but they're still genuinely felt. But at the same time, Russia doesn't see itself as Sweden. It doesn't believe that it can suddenly transform itself into a country that generates a great standard of living for its people, but doesn't have great power ambitions in the world. And I think Putin and a large swath of the Russian elite are convinced that Russia can't actually continue to exist unless it is a great power. And that the world won't be stable unless Russia plays the role of great power. So that's essentially not just a defensive goal. It's a belief that Russia has to be taken seriously and have the wherewithal to play a role in the world's great issues on a global basis. What's interesting to me is, how do you do that? How do you be a great power? How do you get there? Because you can't just declare it and have it become a reality. Part of it has to be rooted in an economy that actually generates real wealth. How do you do that, as Peter's pointed out, unless you somehow liberalize that system enough to unleash the creative powers of the Russian people? How Putin handles that is going to be a very interesting and difficult question in his next 6 years in power. You also have to have other great powers recognizing, acknowledging that you're a great power in some way. And right now, that's a real problem for Russia, because the world's other great powers, with the possible exception of China, which takes a somewhat condescending attitude toward Russia, I believe, aren't treating Russia as a great power, and they're showing no inclination to do that. In order to get that kind of recognition, that respect, Putin's going to have to do some different things, I think. There's going to have to be some adjustment, because I think, as Peter pointed out, much of what Russia has done in the last several years has actually been counterproductive to that great power agenda.
Let me actually, I want to ask each of you a follow-up question, because I think Sidney in his question raised a fairly nuanced point of, where would Russia take risks? And there's a fairly well researched idea in psychology that people actually are, generally speaking, people are more prone to take risks to avoid losses than to pursue gains. do the three of you think that that is something that also holds true in the case of the Russian leadership, or is the Russian leadership kind of perhaps counter to that and more willing to take risks for gain?
A very short answer for me on that is I think that they will take risks for gain in Ukraine. I think the history of the Baltic states is so different that they wouldn't take risks to try to bring the Baltic states back in. But I would point squarely at Ukraine as far as an area where they may take what we define as a risk. But depending on how they viewed us at that particular moment. Don't forget that their invasion of Afghanistan was what they thought of. The Americans had come out of Southeast Asia with their tails between their legs. They got this Jimmy Carter thing. And they may not notice. We'll be in and out of there before the Americans would notice what they were doing. So I would say Ukraine.
Paul, I really like the point you made about sometimes what the psychologists have discovered is people are more prone to take risks more out of security and defense purposes. I would say Syria totally fits that mold. That was a case where the war was going really badly. Russia's major geopolitical asset in the Middle East was at risk of being lost, and that was pretty central to Russia's position in the Middle East. And Putin took a risk. Now, I would say it was a pretty pragmatic, modest risk, relatively low cost, and he got a lot out of it. He's gotten a fair amount of mileage, although now we're at a point where we'll see where this end game is. Trying to manage Assad is a real challenge. I would not want that job. We've seen multiple times now where you can tell that Assad's most recent visit to Sochi, you're reading the transcript of the talks there, and you do get the sense Putin is it one more time. I think this is the third time at least. He's trying to lean on it, saying this transition thing really needs to get moving, and you need to get some traction with even people you don't necessarily like. And Assad's saying, yeah, we're going to look at the UN and talk to some people about a process, and he's clearly doing the Heisman here to tell Putin, I'm in charge here. I'm not giving up anything to anybody, just in case you feel I might do that. So I'm just stuck there with Putin for a lot of reasons, and one of the most important ones I think is he's still smarting from a comment by a senior U.S. official that they were a regional power way back. And I believe that official was President Obama. That would be that person. Thank you. I was trying to be diplomatic here. But I do think that's part of this. And playing that role in Syria still makes him a player. Now everybody's talking about how strong and powerful and assertive and projecting some power. They've had a chance to test that and cool new toys militarily. There's been a lot of gains here, but at the end of the day now, I think it's going to get harder and harder. The problems with Iran, they will get lost over time, and trying to manage Assad. So he's gotten himself in a place that's increasingly challenging.
Very quickly, I agree. I think the Russians are more likely to run risks when they perceive they're under threat. Fear is the most powerful motivator when it comes to running risks. And I think that's true in Ukraine, which I regard as the most important country in the world from Russia's perspective. The so-called near abroad is its highest priority, and within the near abroad, Ukraine is by far the most important. So that's an area where, of course, they're going to run the most risks. It's their highest priority, and I think they believe they've got the most to lose there. I think Syria also fits that. But there's one interesting counter-narrative there, and that's meddling in the United States. You can, to some degree, construe that as defensive, right? You know, you've got to stop messing around in Russia, so we're going to give you a dose of this, see how it feels, and then maybe you'll reconsider what you're doing. But it's a relatively high-risk thing to do. Now, I would argue, in response to that the Russians didn't think it was very high risk. You know, paying a few hundred trolls to post some things on social media, doesn't look like a real aggressive move from their perspective. Obviously, in retrospect, we've reacted to this far more vigorously than I think the Russians would have thought.
Thanks very much. Okay, we've got We got 16 minutes here. I have 4 people with questions, so let's take them in pairs. I want to preserve a few minutes for our panelists to have any final comments at the end. So John Hudson, you first.
Hi, thanks. John Hudson with the Washington Post. Peter, I just wanted to take advantage of your knowledge of the Russian system on an important development that's happened recently. This would be the April 6th sanctioning of Oleg Deripaska and the Rusal, which has obviously had a massive impact on the global metals market and also has irritated European allies who have been affected by it. I think what's confused some people is that whether or not Deripaska is sort of someone who is characterized adequately as a Putin crony, or because some people believe he's sort of a Yeltsin-era oligarch instead. So can you give a sense of Deripaska's sort of power in the Russian political system and what the impact of the targeting of him might be sort of in Russia?
And let's have Keith, your question. And I think what I'll do is just turn to one of you to answer each of these questions so we can move it along.
So we may not be able to identify Putin's specific intentions, but we should be able to notice major strategic reorientations of Russia. And I've been increasingly seeing noise about, the West is coming to the end of its 500-year dominance in the world and, the rise of the East. And Russia does seem to be genuinely making a bit of a strategic reorientation towards Asia, not just China, but also towards Japan. And I guess I wanted to get the panelists a sense of what that might mean and whether that's actually happening.
Peter, I think the Deripaska question came to you. Perhaps we can start with that.
I suspect there are a lot of people in the room who may be better qualified to answer that, but my personal thinking is I think Deripaska does have a relationship with Putin. Absolutely. The result thing is very complicated, and I've been struck by the pushback that's developed in the U.S. because people realize the implications specifically for Boeing. And I think people are realizing when you start talking about sanctioning, what are the countervailing steps or measures that might be taken by the other side, and things are pretty complicated. I don't know whether that answers the question correctly. Somebody want to do the initial thing?
George, perhaps you, the strategic realignment, unless Milt, if you want to add.
I think that with Kaplan's model in Asia, I think that if you were a geostationary satellite looking at where all the human activity was for the last 500 years, it would have looked over the mid-Atlantic and mainly Western Europe and then sort of Western and later. I think that satellite has moved over the Indian Ocean a little bit, where it's getting a look at that. There's an awful lot of demographic and political activity that's going to make that an interesting area to play around in. We'll see the Soviets moving over there, whether we're doesn't mean that we're going to be diminished in the West as rapidly as others might. But I think that there is something to this Soviet or the Russian future looking at that. Very early in the game.
Yeah, I do think there is I'll call it a rebalancing, not so much a reorientation in Russia's orientation toward the East and the West. Clearly, I agree with Surkov. Russia no longer sees itself integrating into the West, and that's been true for quite some time. I don't think it sees itself as fully integrating into the East either. I think what you're seeing is greater emphasis on relationships in Asia, China, and part of what I think what's going on between Russia and Japan is Russia balancing that relationship with China as well, making sure it has some hedges and alternatives and counterbalances in that. But overall, I think that orientation more to the middle between East and West and less its westward tilt has clearly been going on. Yes.
Okay, let's come over here to Christian Whiten first, and then I'll get to.
Hi, Christian Whiten from the Center for the National Interest. A quickie for Milt. Just given all the challenges George outlined to tradecraft, to using official cover intelligence officers against the Russia, would it make sense, do you think, to make greater reliance, to frankly use a Russian trick on illegal, not just assets, but on illegal officers who are in place in a long time in Russia who might not be as susceptible to travel protection?
You know, I spent more time outside of the CIA than most anybody's been inside. So I think what's going on, I know anything about what's going on today in the age of an iPhone. The point is that in dangerous or denied operational areas, if you can get anybody out of the country, the best thing is to do that meeting. I mean, not necessarily London, but you can pick any number of other places in the world, and Russians can move so much more freely than they would imagine. That's a big option. You know, we used to try to stay 10 steps ahead of surveillance to a Russian pass somewhere in Moscow. And I mean, it's, you know, yes, the argument is spying the second oldest profession or the first, I don't know, but it hadn't changed a lot until about now. I guess these are big changes, but it's a nice way of saying I have no idea what we can do today.
Jonathan Landon with Reuters. This is for George, but anyone else can jump in. George, you talk about, when you're talking about the interaction with the Americans, you focus on the intervention in the 2016 election. But aren't Russian challenges become far more extensive than that? You have the military challenges alone, the flyovers, the dangerous passovers of American naval vessels and aircraft. You have the deployment of nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad. You have the deployment of these new nuclear-armed or capable cruise missiles in southern Russia. There are no, that we know of, new arms control, conventional or nuclear, going on. The strategic dialogue is all but dead. Don't those challenges? Don't you have to add those challenges to what's happened in the election to get a much broader picture of where the Russians are?
Yeah, I think you do. But many of the things that you're talking about there are more constants than variables. Peter alluded to the comment that President Obama made, and he wasn't the only one a few years ago, that Russia is basically a regional power, poses a regional threat, out of weakness, not out of strength, I think, if I recall correctly what the President said. And he said this after Ukraine, after the annexation, after the launch of the hybrid brave war in eastern Ukraine. He was basically saying, hey, look, let's keep the Russian threat in perspective here. Now, that has changed. That threat assessment has changed rather dramatically to the point where we don't think Russia's a regional threat. We think they're an existential threat to the United States, to the very heart of our system. And that change in threat perception occurred while all of those things that you were talking about, the flyovers, the developments of new strategic weapon systems, the Kaliningrad activities that you're talking about, all of that has been going on for quite some time. So those are not what is driving our threat perception. Now, are they real issues? Are they real things that we have to contend with in the bilateral relationship, in the multilateral activities of the international system? Absolutely. But I don't think they tell us much about how we view Russian intentions.
Anybody else have a response to that?
Those are very, very old things that have been, I say, all the way back when submarines were playing games with each other, or movement of missile systems. That is indeed a constant. It's been around for a long time. But I think that the package as a whole probably represents something new with what you're looking at. I'm not sure.
And even in the height of the Cold War, we still have a strategic fire control negotiations and agreements struck. That is not happening anymore.
We were still developing those systems on both sides. As George said, this didn't happen overnight.
Let me ask you some brief but important question. It was an excellent book with the title The Main Enemy. You wrote it. I wrote it. For a number of years, most of us would not consider Eurasian as the main enemy. I think that many of us would disagree how we came to our current predicament. Who was responsible? What were Russian intentions? What were our misjudgments? But am I correct that for better or worse, we now should consider Russia the main enemy? And I'm not asking whether this is the view of the American mainstream. I'm asking what is the view of the panel?
Well, let me.
And incorporate into this any closing thoughts you have. And then
I did with my dear friend Jim rather than write that book, The Main Enemy. It's sort of the
Which was an excellent book.
Characterization of who we were. We were the main enemy. Is that I had disagreements with people when I was at CIA. And some people sort of hated the Soviet Union because they were communists. And I thought, well, they also got 30,000 warheads. And it'll go more or less downrange. So that's a more logical way to approach it. Today, where are we? Does anybody pose that type of threat? I don't think we'd ever look at China right with what we know now, and they got on the foreheads. So to answer your question, I think I could probably say, well, the main enemy thing is not a bad characterization, because who's second place?
There's a lot packed into that characterization that I think we need to unpack and get right. In Russian, Glavny protivnik is different than Vrag, right? Main opponents versus an enemy. Russia is an adversary, it's an opponent on the world chessboard, no question about that. But that's a different thing than believing that Russia is our primary enemy and that its opposition to the United States is a derivation of fundamental incompatibilities between our political system and theirs. Why is that? It's because if that enemy status is immutable, it derives from things that are constant about us and about Russia, you can't change that. It exists independent of our behavior. And there's nothing to do other than to outcompete them, to defeat them. And I don't think that's what's going on at all here. I think a significant portion of the animosity and hostility that exists on both sides derives not from the nature of their systems, but because of behaviors in the world that we have some control over on both sides. It's a basis for negotiation and talk. Backed by force, backed by leverage, absolutely, yes. But it's not something that's irreconcilable fundamentally.
Here. I agree with George. I see it more as protivnik rather than Glavny. I put China somewhere on that list. I think there's a number of things we should be worried about. If we become too obsessed with Russia, we run the risk of missing some other serious issues. Some of them are like transnational. I worry about cyber a huge amount. That seems subject to another talk. I want to report just 1 to 6 points on the Asia-China question. I was struck immediately when the sanctions were imposed after Crimea. The first place Putin went was China, very, very quickly. I think within 2 months. And then by the end of the year, they signed this major new deal on oil and gas, which has continued, by the way, since then. If you look more broadly, the outreach to Japan, a little bit to South Korea, and then I was also struck by the major moves in the Middle East in terms of Russia's efforts to buy into a lot of, not just energy per se, but the exploitation, the production, the pipelines, the logistics of the energy business struck me as a little bit of an insurance policy Putin was pursuing to ensure certain streams of revenue, because he could see what was going to happen with the sanctions and also what the Europeans were going to be having to do in support of the sanctions, because they were as hardline about his Crimea as the U.S. So in closing, I just want to read a great quote from the Robert Lakewold book that came out a little while ago, which I subscribe to completely. He's saying, as we get into this new Cold War, it's going to move through stages, and it truly will. When the two sides relent and seek their own détente, the earlier experience will have an echo in two respects. First, contemporary Russia's preoccupation with being treated as an equal resonates no less powerfully than it did for Brezhnev's Soviet Union. I absolutely believe that. They want to be treated as an equal, certainly Putin does. And then secondly, this is right spot on, second, success will depend on mutually agreeable rules of the game, where from the beginning, the interaction between the U.S. and Russia has been the most fraught in those countries that once comprised the Soviet Union. Ukraine, hopefully not others, but we certainly saw it in Georgia. If there are any movements or activities where the perception is NATO or even the EU is making inroads that they see potentially as leading to NATO, they're going to react. But that area in particular, because it's of direct national security interest, I think will remain one of the diciest areas where we'll have to manage our relations with those countries.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Milton.